In September 1983, during an attempt to hijack a tram in the Pervomaisky district of Rostov-on-Don, a 20-year-old educatee of a boarding school for the mentally retarded named Shaburov was detained. The young man not only did not deny his guilt but confessed to stealing a Moskvich car. Then he suddenly told that, together with his friend named Kalenik, who also had mental problems, they killed 2 children, a 12-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy. Soon, the second suspect was also brought to the department. Kalenik turned out to be even more talkative and told the detectives about 2 more accomplices, simultaneously taking upon himself the murder of 7 people. From the testimony of the suspect Kalenik, in August, at a suburban railway station in the city of Rostov-on-Don, I met a girl of 6 to 7 years old, whose parents went to buy tickets, put her on trolleybus No. 1, drove to the Nakhichevan Bazaar, crossed to the other side. I led her into the grove, took off her dress, raped in the usual and perverted form, clothes burned. I stabbed her in the head and the stomach. The fact that the corpse of a boy, but not a girl, was found at the crime scene did not embarrass the investigators. It seemed that everything explained the guy's diagnosis. The suspects also described the circumstances of other crimes in detail. They told how they met their victims and took them to deserted places, how they abused, raped, and killed them. But, after a while, the detainees unanimously refused to testify, and then again confirmed them. But due to the mentality of the suspects, the investigators did not attach much importance to this. Later it turned out that the investigators helped the suspects to testify. They asked questions in such a way that the detainees did not even understand what was being said. As a result, it was easier for them to say, yes, than to try to get to the bottom of the matter. But the mystery of the case of fools remains how unmistakably the suspects indicated the places where Andrei Chikatilo dealt with his victims. However, it is quite possible that the detectives simply took the detainees for investigative experiments to the right places. But while the defendants of the case of fools were under arrest, terrible murders continued in Novoshakhtinsk and Shakhty. From September 1983 to early January 1984, several girls and 2 boys became victims of an unknown perpetrator. The maniac inflicted more than 70 stab wounds on one of them. Investigating these massacres, the Soviet militia again committed negligence. In September 1983, Chikatilo killed a 22-year-old tramp Valentina Chuchulina. The girl suffered from mental retardation, and the maniac easily lured her into the thicket. The locals found the body of the deceased shortly after the murder and immediately reported about it to the militia. But the task force that left did not find the described place, and in order not to continue the search, the law enforcement officers preferred to destroy the statement of eyewitnesses. Only when someone again stumbled upon the body in November, the detectives finally bothered to find and examine the crime scene. But there was little benefit from this. The body had time to decompose. Although the murders continued, the detectives stubbornly went on the wrong track, dealing with the case of fools. Several more mentally retarded people were detained, who admitted that the latest murders were their work. Meanwhile, in January and February 1984, 2 female bodies were found in the Rostov Aviator Park. After that, the detectives detained another mentally ill suspect, a disabled person who molested a passerby. He immediately confessed to crimes that he did not commit, and could not commit due to physical disabilities. Terrible rumors spread among Rostovites about a gang of lunatics operating in the city and its area. But then the investigation of the mysterious murders was entrusted to a new investigation team led by Issa Kostoyev, and his detectives quickly found all the inconsistencies in the investigation. The case of Fools was terminated in 1985, and all suspects were released. One of the detainees died in a pre-trial detention center. One of those who tried to help the operatives in their hunt for Andrei Chikatilo was the psychiatrist Alexander Bakarnowski. He carefully studied the case materials and compiled a fairly accurate psychological profile of the killer. In particular, the specialist suggested that the killer is most likely a family man, looks good, and does not belong to the marginalized. Otherwise, he could hardly have entered into the trust of the victims so easily. Bakarnowski also drew attention to the fact that murders are most often committed on Tuesdays and Thursdays, while the bodies are found not far from the railway tracks, along which the Novokirkisk-Rostov trains follow. Based on these observations, the psychiatrist suggested that the maniac has shift work or goes on business trips and most often travels by public transport, like trains or buses. Moreover, Bakarnowski even compiled a list of professions, where he indicated the supply industry, in which Andrei Chikatilo worked. But the profile of the maniac drawn up by the psychiatrist did not help the law enforcement agencies in any way, even at the moment when the murderer, who fell under all the criteria of Bakarnowski, was detained by the militia. It happened in the fall of 1984 that year 15 people died at the hands of a maniac. And in total by that time Andrei Chikatilo had committed 32 murders. One night, a district inspector serving at the Rostov bus station noticed a 47-year-old man in the company of a young tramp. It was Chikatilo. The militiaman detained him and took him to the militia station. The operatives were immediately alerted by the contents of the detainee's suitcase: a jar of Vaseline, rope, soap, and a knife. In addition, as the psychiatrist Bakarnowski predicted, the detainee worked as a supplier and was constantly on business trips. But then the experts tripped up the investigation, studying the traces of sperm left by the maniac after one of the crimes. The experts mistakenly established the fourth blood type, and the detainee Chikatilo had the second one. He quickly found an explanation for the contents of the suitcase. Vaseline was needed for shaving, soap for hygiene procedures, and a rope for dressing the load. The militiaman believed Chikatilo and let him go. Shortly after the story at the station, the murderer was caught stealing a battery and spent 3 months behind bars. Until December 1984. Once free, Chikatilo, who by that time was nicknamed the Rostov Ripper and Citizen X in absentia, moved with his family to Novokirkisk, where he got a new job. But he did not change his profile. He again became a supplier, which allowed him to continue to go on business trips. Chikatilo committed the first post-moving murder in August 1985. While on a business trip in Moscow, he went to the airport for a ticket. During a trip by train, the murderer met 18-year-old Natalia Poklistova and followed her out on the Aviationaya platform. Under the pretext of taking her home, the path lay through the forest once in a deserted place. Chikatilo threw the girl to the ground, tied her up, and tried to have sexual intercourse. However, the killer once again failed. He received sexual satisfaction only by slashing the victim with a knife and cutting off her nipples. Less than a month later, The maniac came across a new victim, a 17-year-old Irina Gulyayeva whom he met at the bus station in the city of Shakhty. This time, Chikatilo did not cut out the uterus and the nipples from the victim, although he later admitted during interrogations. Without this, the crime did not give him complete satisfaction. The operatives who trailed the killer, seeing that the crimes were continuing, went on an unprecedented operation, code-named Operation Forest Path. About 10 million rubles were allocated for it. In April 1986, helicopters were raised into the air, circling over Rostov forests and fields, and militia women dressed in civilian clothes were constantly on duty at railway stations and trains. They acted as baits on which the maniac was supposed to peck. The militiamen were helped by druzhniks, in the ranks of which Andrei Chikatilo himself turned out to be. Realizing the scope of the operation, the killer decided to keep a low profile. As a result, Operation Forest Path helped to solve more than 1,000 other crimes. Murders, thefts, robberies, and rapes. Law enforcement agencies have collected information on 50,000 people with sexual behavior disorders. But the operation never achieved its main goal, the capture of Citizen X. Operatives checked more than 160,000 motorists and 2,000 people convicted of sexual crimes. And since the victims of the maniac often became boys whom Chikatilo tried to rape, all homosexuals of the Rostov Oblast fell under suspicion. The investigation tried to enlist the help of the legal advisor of the Rostov Dermatov Neurological Dispensary, which had a card file with 1,000 names of homosexuals. But she refused to disclose the data of her wards and tried to warn the detectives that their version was wrong. The legal advisor noted that homosexuals often have a subtle mental organization and would not be able to commit such atrocities. In the end, she turned out to be right. But before it, more than 400 homosexuals went through the investigation. Some of them committed suicide. Others died during interrogations. Their hearts could not stand it. Chikatilo began to kill again. In May 1987, during a business trip to the Sverdlovsk region, he dealt with a 13-year-old boarding school student Oleg Makarenkov who was returning to an educational institution after spending the weekend at home. The maniac himself reported this crime to the investigators during interrogations in 1990. After that, it turned out that at the place indicated by Chikatilo, in July 1987, a body was indeed found. But due to severe damage and decomposition, experts identified it as female. Because of this, for 3 years it remained in the morgue as unidentified. After 1987, Chikatilo changed his approach to finding victims. He began to kill boys more and more often. In July 1987, a 12-year-old resident of the city of Zaporizhia, Ivan Bilovitsky, who ran into a forest to smoke, became a victim of the murderer. Then, the 15-year-old resident of Leningrad Yuri Tereshchenok, who was killed in September of the same year, believed Chikatilo that he was organizing a fake sick leave for him to skip a class. Under this pretext, the teenager went to the dacha to the killer. The same dacha turned out to be a trap for a 9-year-old schoolboy Alexei Voronko from the city of Ilovaisk. He had a chance to escape. He was walking with Chikatilo when his friends met him and invited him to walk with them. But the boy preferred to go with a new acquaintance. A terrible death awaited him. Chikatilo literally smashed his head with a metal rod, which he picked up along the way. a 15-year-old honors student Yevgeny Muratov from the city of Sverevo, who was returning from Rostov on a fateful day for him in June 1988. Also accepted the offer of the stranger to celebrate his enrollment in a technical school at his dacha. The teenager followed the killer at the Leskors station. When they moved a kilometer from the railway embankment, Chikatilo pounced on the victim. Having forcefully opened the teenager's mouth, the maniac cut off part of his tongue and ate it in front of his own eyes. And then he opened the boy's abdominal cavity, and cut off his genitals. From February to August 1989, Andrei Chikatilo committed 4 more crimes. He killed 2 girls and 2 boys. After that, he dug up a grave in the cemetery of the city of Shakti. Later, during interrogations, Chikatilo claimed that he originally dug it for himself. He allegedly wanted to commit suicide. But in the end, it turned out to be a 10-year-old boy Alexei Kobotov's grave. He met the killer on his way to the video store and agreed to the offer to watch movies at his house. But Chikatilo took the boy straight to the cemetery, stunned him with a blow to the head with a hammer, abused him, and buried him in a dug grave. The mother, in search of her child, went around all the nearest railway stations and the electric trains that passed through them, hoping to learn at least something. She showed everyone a photograph of her son. Among others, the woman showed a photograph to a middle-aged passenger on the train, who kept adjusting his glasses. In 1990, in the TV news about the capture of Andrei Chikatilo, she recognized him as the same man with glasses and told law enforcement officers about it. They turned to the killer who was sitting in the pre-trial detention center, and he calmly confessed to the murder of the boy and showed the place where he buried the child. Hoping to make progress in the case of Citizen X, investigator Issa Kostoyev went for help from another serial killer, Anatoly Slivko, who was awaiting the death penalty. He was not opposed to expressing his thoughts, but through the prism of his own mental deviations, he made several erroneous assumptions. For example, according to Slivko, the investigation had to look for 2 killers at once, one who kills girls, and the other who kills boys. At the same time, Slivko described the prospects for the investigation with the words, "This is impossible to find such a person. I know from myself." In this regard, Slivko turned out to be right. Chikatilo was never found. An accidental help to detain the murderer. But before falling into the hands of justice, Citizen X committed 8 more murders. He dealt with 6 boys aged 10 to 16 years and 2 girls. One of them became his last victim. On November 6, 1990, on the train Rostov-Lakaya, Chikatilo met a 22-year-old Svetlana Korostik who agreed to go home to the fellow traveler. He knew the places they were passing well and decided to kill the girl in the thicket of the forest, where he had already committed crimes. But Chikatilo was afraid to get off at the sparsely populated Leskors station because of constant patrols and chose a stop where there were always crowds of passengers. The murderer's calculation was justified. The operatives on duty at the Lesostep station did not pay any attention to the strange-looking couple, having lured his companion into the thicket of the forest. Chikatilo attacked her. The girl tried to resist and even scratched the attacker. Later, when examining the body under the nails, they found particles of the maniac's skin, but the forces were unequal. Having pierced the victim with a knife, the maniac cut out her genitals, bit off her nipples, and went away. But Chikatilo lost his vigilance. He reasoned that if he was alone, he would not attract the attention of law enforcement officers, and therefore went back through the Leskors station. At that moment, militia officer Igor Rybakov was on duty at the station. The militiaman immediately noticed a strange man in a business suit coming out of the forest. The passenger was not at all like the local summer residents and hard workers. Rybakov reported later, "Twigs and leaves stuck to his clothes. I watched him for about 15 minutes and examined him carefully to remember. Then, I introduced himself, showed him my certificate, and asked him to show his documents. The killer was not at a loss. He said that he had come to a friend in the village of Donskoy and calmly showed his passport. The law enforcement officer wrote down the data in his notebook and released the stranger. There was no formal reason for his detention, and only when Korostik's body was found, and the investigators studied the records of the operatives on duty at the surrounding stations. Did they pay attention to the name they already knew, Chikatilo? The suspect was then put under surveillance. And Chikatilo himself, not realizing that he was under surveillance, continued to look for a new victim, looking closely and pestering children, teenagers, and girls. After observing the suspicious behavior of the object, the investigators decided to detain him. On November 20, 1990, Chikatilo took a day off and went to the surgeon. His penultimate victim Viktor Tishchenko bit the killer's finger, and it became amictic. Returning home, he took a jar and went either for beer or kvass. But on the way back, Chikatilo's road was blocked by people in militia uniforms. He did not resist and calmly allowed himself to be handcuffed. During a search, knives, a hammer, and shoes in which he killed, as well as the same suitcase with a rope and Vaseline inside were found. But Chikatilo was in no hurry to speak. He knew that the investigation had no direct evidence against him. In the meantime, the 15th day of detention was coming to an end, and then psychiatrist Alexander Bakarnowski arrived to talk with him. 3 hours was enough for the specialist to bring Chikatilo to a frank conversation. Bursting into tears, the maniac began to testify. The days before the verdict was passed, Chikatilo whiled away in a solitary cell of the KGB detention center. The choice of such a serious institution was not accidental. The investigators seriously feared that the suspect would not live to see the trial. Among the relatives of his victims were those who worked in the correctional system. So, there was a risk that these people would use their connections and arrange reprisals. Many wanted to lynch Chikatilo. At the trial, the father of one of the murdered boys, whom the maniac inflicted 42 stab wounds, said that he wanted the accused to have a mild sentence, but not out of pity. The man who lost his child wanted to wait for the release of Chikatilo and do with him what he did with his son and other victims. The process itself was very difficult. Recognized as sane, Chikatilo posed as a mental patient, insulted the convoy and judges, took off his pants, and showed everyone his genitals. The killer told on the court, "Where I worked and where I appeared, there were corpses along the way. That's how it worked out. Every year. It is clear that I am a mistake of nature. A mad beast. I went wild in this society." Those who wanted to deal with Chikatilo were barely restrained by the convoy and the bars of the iron cage in which the defendant was sitting. The women shouted, "He killed us all. We will judge him ourselves." Ambulance paramedics were on duty at the scene, injecting sedatives to those in need. Relatives of the victims fainted when the murderer talked about his crimes. On October 14, 1992, the Rostov Regional Court sentenced Andrei Chikatilo to execution by shooting. This verdict was met with thunderous applause by those present in the courtroom. The court found that Chikatilo acted from 1978 to 1990 on the territory of the Krasnodar Territory, Sverdlovsk, Rostov, Vladimir, Leningrad, Moscow oblasts, as well as in Uzbekistan and Ukraine. According to the first verdict, 52 people died at the hands of a maniac. 21 boys aged 10 to 16, 14 girls aged 9 to 17, and 17 young women. At the same time, Chikatilo himself took on 56 murders. According to the latest data from law enforcement agencies, he was responsible for even more, 65 victims. The convict appealed the verdict to the Supreme Court of the RSFSR in 1993. The highest court, having studied the case, acquitted Chikatilo on 9 murders due to their lack of evidence, including the murder of Yelena Zakotnova, but this decision did not affect the final verdict. Thus, according to official figures, there are 43 victims on Chikatilo's account. The most famous serial killer in the history of the USSR was executed on the night of February 13–14, 1994. The executioner shot him in the back of the head. The film Citizen X is directly based upon the murders committed by Chikatilo. Inspired by Robert Cullen's non-fiction book The Killer Department, Citizen X largely portrays the investigation of the Rostov Ripper murders through the experiences of Detective Viktor Barakov in his efforts to ensnare the killer. This film casts Jeffrey de Munn as Chikatilo. Although it has little to do with the real events, I highly recommend it as a good detective thriller. A Russian-language television miniseries *Chikatilo illustrating the investigation into the murders committed by Chikatilo, commissioned by OKKO Studios. This series was first broadcast in March 2021, casting Dmitry Nagiyev as Chikatilo, the only son of Chikatilo, Yuri, who, after the detention of his father, changed his surname together with his relatives, ended up on the dock too. He was imprisoned for rape, forgery of documents, and kidnapping. It is known that his hostage was horrified not by the fact of the kidnapping and not even their beatings, but by a small piece of paper with a seal, in order to finally break the victim. Yuri showed his birth certificate. There, in the father column, it was written, Chikatilo Andrei Romanovich. Sources: Best books about forest strip killings. By Robert Cullen. By Mikhail Krivich and Amp. Olgut Olgan. By Richard Lowry. Newspaper articles. Documentary movies. Episode of *Criminal Russia, a Russian documentary television show, which I translated specially for this post. Highly recommend it. Includes extremely shocking photos of some victims of Chikatilo. A Biography Channel documentary. A BBC documentary focusing upon the disproportionate number of serial killers in Rostov-on-Don in the years leading to and immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the efforts of Dr. Alexander Bakarnowski to treat offenders. Other sources: Razrazal Sihiku, Kromzel vsr Podrad, Andrei Chikatilo stal samym straznym ubiche SSSR. On Raspravilsa s desatkami Skolnikov. Tam. Gdy a bile. Ostawalis trupi, Pasimu Sovietskogo Monarcha Andrea Chikatilo Lovili 13 Letai kak za nego stradali. Nevenovni. V. Uslovia Neochividnosti.